He laughed when he saw the photographs. Not the private laugh of a man processing something uncomfortable, but the open, confident laugh of a man sharing a joke with people who understood exactly why it was funny. General Ivan Dashichev set the reconnaissance photographs on the table of his field headquarters outside Suma in the first week of December 1939 and looked at his staff officers with the expression of a man who had just been given confirmation of something he had always suspected. "Bed sheets," he said. "They are fighting us in bed sheets." The photographs showed Finnish reservists moving through a tree line approximately 2 kilometers from the Soviet forward positions. The image quality was adequate for the purpose of identification, which was the problem. The Finnish soldiers were visible in the photographs because the reconnaissance aircraft had caught them in motion between tree lines, crossing a gap in the forest cover. They were wearing, over their regular uniforms, white coverings of various kinds, some clearly military-issue smocks, but many obviously improvised, the kind of white fabric that comes from a linen closet rather than a quartermaster's depot. The shapes were irregular. The fit was imprecise. From the air, in the photographs, they looked exactly like what they were: men who had taken whatever white material was available and put it over their clothes. Dashichev passed the photographs around the table. His staff officers made the appropriate sounds. One of them noted that the Finnish army's inability to properly equip its reservists with standardized winter camouflage was consistent with the broader intelligence assessment of Finnish military capacity. Another observed that an army reduced to raiding its own linen closets was not an army that had prepared seriously for a sustained campaign. These observations were correct. They were also the most expensive observations that staff would make during the entire campaign, because they had identified the right fact and drawn from it the wrong conclusion with the precision of men whose analytical framework was pointed in exactly the wrong direction. The fact was correct. The Finnish army could not provide standardized white camouflage to all of its reservists. The conclusion was wrong. This meant the Finnish army was poorly prepared and its soldiers would be easy to find. What Dashichev and his staff had done, without recognizing it, was mistake the cause for the effect, and the effect for a deficiency. The linen closet camouflage was not evidence of Finnish unpreparedness. It was evidence of Finnish pragmatism operating in the specific way that pragmatism always operates when institutional resources are insufficient. By identifying the functional requirement, stripping away every consideration except that requirement, and solving it with whatever material was at hand. The functional requirement was invisibility against snow. A Finnish soldier in a white bed sheet met this requirement. A Soviet soldier in a dark olive greatcoat did not. The difference between these two facts, measured in the currency of survival and lethality in a Finnish forest in December 1939, was total. Everything else, the regularity of the stitching, the presence of a quartermaster's stamp, whether the white material had been sleeping on a colonel's bed 6 weeks earlier, was irrelevant to the functional requirement in a way that Dashichev's framework could not accommodate. His framework was built around the concept of military professionalism as a unified property. In this framework, standardized equipment was not merely a logistical preference, but an expression of organizational capacity, training quality, and combat effectiveness. An army with standardized equipment was an army that had planned, that had resources, that had the institutional competence to anticipate requirements and meet them through proper channels. An army without standardized equipment was an army that lacked these properties, and an army that lacked these properties was an army that could be defeated. This framework was not irrational. It had been built from real evidence across real campaigns. Armies with poor logistics and improvised equipment do, in most circumstances, perform worse than armies with adequate logistics and standardized equipment. The correlation is genuine. The error was in treating the correlation as the mechanism, in assuming that standardized equipment produced combat effectiveness rather than that both standardized equipment and combat effectiveness were produced by the same underlying organizational capacity, which could in some circumstances generate one without the other. The Finnish army in December 1939 had generated combat effectiveness without standardized camouflage by the direct route of sending men into forests they had spent their lives in, wearing whatever white material made them invisible to the rifles of an army that could not follow them into those forests. The Soviet army had standardized equipment and a greatcoat that made every soldier a dark shape against white snow at ranges that Finnish marksmen could engage without difficulty. One of these facts was in Dashichev's analytical framework. The other was in the forest. The dark olive greatcoat of the Red Army was not a design failure. It had been developed for the operational environments where the Soviet Army had historically operated and where it expected to operate: the steppes of Ukraine, the plains of Western Russia, the mixed terrain of Central Asia. In these environments, a dark olive coat was not a liability. The background was varied. The sight lines were long. The nature of combat in open terrain meant that concealment from individual small arms was less relevant than concealment from artillery observation. And artillery observation was managed through dispersion and cover rather than through individual camouflage. The Finnish forest in winter is not the Ukrainian steppe. This is a fact so obvious that stating it feels almost redundant, and yet its operational implications had not been translated into the equipment decisions that sent Soviet soldiers into the Finnish forest in dark olive coats. The coats were correct for the environment they had been designed for. They were catastrophically wrong for the environment they were being used in. At -35°C, in a Finnish forest in December, visibility conditions are specific and brutal. On clear days, the contrast between dark objects and snow is absolute. A man in a dark coat at 300 meters against a snow field is not a military target requiring skill to identify. He is a silhouette that any rifle can resolve. On overcast days, when the flat winter light removes shadows and reduces contrast in the middle tones, the dark olive of the Soviet coat stands out more clearly than in direct sunlight, because the background lightens without the coat lightening. In snowfall, dark objects remain visible at ranges where white objects have already disappeared into the falling snow. In the specific conditions where Finnish sissy patrols preferred to operate low light, snowfall, the edge of the forest where shadow met open ground, a Soviet soldier in regulation uniform was visible and a Finnish soldier in a bedsheet was not. This asymmetry was not subtle. It did not require specialized training to exploit or detailed tactical analysis to understand. It required only eyes and the experience of looking at people in white and people in dark olive against Finnish snow, which every Finnish soldier had acquired in the first days of the campaign, and which Dashichev had not acquired because he was looking at reconnaissance photographs rather than at the forest. The first week of December passed. Dashichev's division advanced along the road network south of Suma with the methodical confidence of a force that had been told and believed that the resistance it faced was the terminal spasm of an ill-equipped army operating beyond its capacity. The advance was not fast. The roads were poor, the cold was severe, the darkness was 17 hours long and left only 7 hours of usable light. But it was an advance, and the reports that came back to Dashichev's headquarters were the reports of an advance, and the frame that had produced the laughter over the bedsheet photographs remained intact. Then the frame began to crack. The cracking was not dramatic. It was the slow accumulation of a specific type of report, the report that describes an engagement in which Soviet soldiers were killed from positions they had assessed as clear, at ranges they had assessed as safe, by fire from sources they could not locate with any confidence. These reports appeared first as individual incidents. A patrol hit on a road segment that had been traversed twice without contact. A forward position receiving fire from a flank that the defensive perimeter had been organized to cover. A command post in a farmhouse 3 kilometers behind the line struck by something that came from the forest to the north, which the defensive map showed as Finnish held but the tactical situation had suggested was sufficiently distant to be safe. The individual incidents were explicable within the existing framework. Forest terrain produces unexpected angles of fire. Finnish troops had more tactical patience than the Soviet assessment had credited. The forward positions needed better security, and the patrols needed better route discipline. By the third week, the accumulation was no longer explicable within the existing framework, and Dashichev's staff officers were composing their situation reports with the specific care of men who understood that the situation they were reporting contradicted the situation they had been sent to manage. A senior staff officer named Colonel Georgy Ostrovsky filed an internal assessment in mid-December that reached Dashachev's desk with the understated urgency of a document that knows it is saying something the recipient does not want to hear. Ostrovsky had been a competent officer for 15 years and had learned, through those 15 years, the precise calibration required when delivering uncomfortable information upward in the Soviet military hierarchy. Enough specificity to be useful, enough political care to be survivable. He wrote that the division's casualty pattern in the forward sectors showed a consistent characteristic that was not consistent with conventional infantry fire. The casualties were occurring at ranges that the tactical situation had defined as safe, from positions that pre-engagement observation had defined as clear, with a frequency and a precision that suggested either that the Finnish forces had capabilities the pre-campaign intelligence had not identified, or that the terrain was allowing concealment at ranges the Soviet tactical doctrine had not accounted for. He did not write what the evidence most directly suggested, which was that the men in the bed sheets that the general had laughed at were functionally invisible to Soviet observation at the ranges where they were killing Soviet soldiers, and that the Soviet soldiers in their dark olive coats were functionally visible to Finnish observation at the same ranges. He did not write it because it was not the kind of conclusion that a colonel wrote for a general who had laughed at the bed sheets 3 weeks earlier. But Dashachev read the report with the attention of a man who had been in enough difficult situations to know when a carefully worded document was describing something more serious than its wording admitted. He read it twice. He set it down. He looked at the map on the wall of his headquarters, which showed the division's positions, the Finnish positions as estimated, and the terrain features between them. The terrain features between them were forest, Finnish forest, December forest, the same forest that was in the reconnaissance photographs, the photographs with the men in the bed sheets. He asked his intelligence officer how many of the Finnish soldiers in the division's sector were believed to be wearing white camouflage. The intelligence officer said that based on available observation, the estimate was somewhere between 60 and 80%. The remainder were likely wearing white coverings of various improvised types that might not have been captured in observation if they were stationary. Dashachev asked what the observation range was for a Finnish soldier in white camouflage against snow at the tree line. The intelligence officer said that in the conditions typical of the sector, with the light angles and the snow cover present in December, the effective observation range for a white camouflaged individual who was stationary or moving slowly was approximately 20 to 30 meters in clear conditions and less than 10 meters in snowfall or low light. Dashachev did not say anything for a moment. He asked what the observation range was for a Soviet soldier in standard uniform against snow. The intelligence officer said that in the same conditions, a Soviet soldier in the dark olive greatcoat was observable at ranges between 200 and 400 meters in clear conditions and between 50 and 100 meters in snowfall or low light. The mathematics of this asymmetry are not complicated. A Finnish soldier became visible at 20 meters. A Soviet soldier became visible at 200 meters. In the forest between them, the Finnish soldier knew where the Soviet soldier was for the entire last 180 meters of any approach, and the Soviet soldier did not know where the Finnish soldier was until the Finnish soldier chose to make that known, which was typically at a range of 20 meters or less, which was a range at which the outcome of an engagement between the two soldiers was not determined by training or by the quality of their weapons but by the simple fact that one of them had been shooting at a target for the last 180 meters, and the other had just discovered that a target existed. Dashachev had laughed at the bed sheets. The bed sheets were winning every engagement in his sector for which there was sufficient light to determine cause. The report that Dashachev filed with the Leningrad Military District headquarters in the third week of December 1939 is a document worth reading carefully, not for what it says but for the architecture of what it carefully declines to say. It requests, in formal military language, an emergency resupply of white camouflage overgarments for the division's forward infantry elements, citing the specific operational conditions of the Finnish theater and the documented impact of visibility asymmetry on casualty patterns. It describes the terrain conditions in the sector. It describes the Finnish camouflage practice. It provides the observation range estimates that his intelligence officer had given him. It does not mention the photographs. It does not mention the laughter. It does not contain the word bed sheets. What it contains, in the formal language of a military logistics request, is the complete and unambiguous acknowledgement that the Finnish soldiers in their improvised white coverings had a tactical advantage over his soldiers in their regulation uniforms that was producing a one-directional casualty pattern that the division could not sustain. The request was processed. The resupply was approved. White camouflage overgarments began moving toward the front through the Soviet logistics system, which in December 1939 was already under the stress of sustaining a campaign that had been projected to last 12 days and was now entering its fourth week with no clear terminal point. The overgarments arrived in the forward sectors in January. By that point, the soldiers who received them had spent 6 weeks as dark shapes against white snow, and the education that those 6 weeks had provided about what visibility asymmetry meant in Finnish forest combat had been paid for in a currency that quartermaster requisitions cannot retroactively recover. The Finnish reservists who received their white coverings before the campaign began had not thought of themselves as making a sophisticated tactical decision. They had thought of themselves as solving an obvious problem with the materials available. The problem was this: they were going to a place that was white, and they needed to not be seen. The materials available were what was in their houses. The solution was to take white things from their houses and wear them over their uniforms. A Finnish veteran of the Winter War, Erkki Laukkanen, a farmer from Heim who had served in the reserve infantry, described in a 1974 interview the morning he had packed for mobilization. He had taken his white winter work smock, 2 sheets from the linen cabinet, and a white tablecloth. He had put them in his pack. His wife had asked what he was doing with the tablecloth. He had said he needed it to not be seen. She had asked him to bring it back when the war was over. He did not bring it back. He was wearing it in late December when a Soviet patrol passed within 15 meters of his position without identifying him, and he lay still for 40 minutes until they were gone, and the tablecloth was in the snow by the end of the engagement, and it was not possible to retrieve it without moving, and moving was not something he was doing until the patrol was completely clear of the area. He apologized to her about the tablecloth when he came home. She told him not to be foolish. The tablecloth had done exactly what a tablecloth is not supposed to do and exactly what a piece of military camouflage is supposed to do. It had made a man invisible. It had cost nothing beyond its own replacement. It had required no quartermaster, no standardization committee, no supply chain, no production facility, no institutional approval process. It had required a man looking at a problem and reaching into his linen cabinet. This is the part of the story that is not about Finland and not about 1939. It is about the institutional reflex that made Dashichev laugh at the bed sheets, which is the reflex that occurs in every organization that has become large enough and formal enough to begin treating standardization as a value in itself, rather than as an instrument in service of a function. Standardization is genuinely valuable. It enables interoperability, logistics efficiency, training scalability, and the consistent performance that complex organizations depend on. These are not small things. They are the reasons that large organizations with standardized systems routinely outperform small organizations without them in the domains where standardization's advantages are relevant. The error is not in valuing standardization. The error is in allowing the value of standardization to become so embedded in the organizational identity that deviation from the standard begins to read as deficiency rather than as adaptation. When Dashichev looked at the bed sheets and saw an ill-equipped army, he was reading deviation from standard as deficiency, when he should have been asking whether the deviation was producing a better outcome than the standard in this specific environment. The bed sheets were producing a better outcome than the standard. They were producing it in the most direct and measurable way possible, which is that the men wearing them were harder to kill than the men not wearing them. In the specific environment of the Finnish forest in December, this was the only outcome that mattered, and the bed sheets were winning it, while the standardized dark olive greatcoats were losing it. The reflex that produces laughter at the improvised solution is the reflex of an institution that has stopped asking whether the solution works, and has started asking whether the solution looks like what solutions are supposed to look like. This reflex is comfortable. It is even, within its own logic, rational. Solutions that look like solutions usually are solutions, in the environments for which the institution's standards were developed. The problem is that environments change and standards lag, and in the lag between the environment and the standard, the improvised solution that works is always more valuable than the standardized solution that doesn't. A Finnish bed sheet against Finnish snow in December 1939 was worth more than a Soviet quartermaster's stamp. This was not a complicated fact. It was visible to anyone who looked at the forest with the question what works here rather than the question what looks like what we have decided military professionalism looks like. Dashichev looked at the forest with the second question and laughed. The forest, and the men in the bed sheets who knew it, provided the answer to the first question at a cost that the laughter had not anticipated. The white overgarments arrived in January. The Soviet soldiers put them on. They were no longer dark shapes against white snow. Some of the visibility asymmetry that had been generating the one-directional casualty pattern was reduced. The tactical situation did not reverse itself, because camouflage was only one component of the asymmetry between the two forces, and the other components, terrain knowledge, ski mobility, the darkness that the Finnish sissy owned and the Soviet infantry did not, the cold that the Finnish soldiers had grown up in and the Soviet soldiers had not, remained unchanged. But the specific disadvantage of being perfectly visible at 200 meters to a man who was invisible at 20 meters was reduced. It had taken 6 weeks and a logistics request that Dashichev had written with the careful language of a man who understood that he was documenting his own error without naming it. He never mentioned the photographs again. His subsequent reports on Finnish camouflage practice are clinical and detailed, describing the Finnish approach with the neutral respect of a professional who has updated his assessment based on new information. The new information had been provided by his own soldiers' bodies, arranged by the Finnish winter in positions that made the update unavoidable. The bed sheets were not brought up in any official after-action review. The photographs were not referenced in any doctrinal analysis of the campaign's early failures. The laughter in the field headquarters in the first week of December was a private moment and remained a private moment, absorbed into the larger silence that the Soviet military system maintained around the specific failures that implicated the analytical framework rather than the individuals operating within it. The tablecloth that Erkki Laukkanen had left in the snow outside Heim in December 1939 was under 2 meters of new snow by January, gone from any surface that could be observed or recovered, dissolved into the landscape that had always been its more legitimate home than any dining room table. It had done its job completely. It had cost nothing. It had required no general's approval, no quartermaster's stamp, no institutional committee to recognize its value before authorizing its deployment. It had required a man who knew what the problem was, and a linen cabinet with white things in it, and the complete absence of embarrassment about the gap between what the solution looked like and what solutions were supposed to look like. The army that dressed to be seen as powerful made itself visible to every rifle in the forest, and the army that dressed to be invisible won every argument about which one was more powerful.